All right, so welcome to hopefully a not so long kind of mini lecture on language acquisition and language theory through kind of more of a socio-linguistic understanding of how language is developed. I will be kind of summarizing about 3.5 chapters of The Language Learning a Lifelong Process by Joseph Foley, Linda Thompson, who kind of present how young people and children and kids develop language and learn and acquire language, and they use more of that kind of social linguistics kind of framework. So rather than assigning 3.5 chapters of reading, I'll just kind of summarizing, hopefully in a not so long lecture, and then dispersing some thinking and writing activities that hopefully will lead to some discussion. So without further ado, let's kind of get started on doing this lecture. So the first thing, as you will start to understand, is I always like to start a lesson on writing into the day, or writing and thinking into the day, getting kind of using a writing to learn activity. So the first activity I want you to do is think and write for a few minutes on kind of some possible difficulties young people may face when learning a first language. So what are kind of the roadblocks, and how young people might, when they, roadblocks or troubles or things that might get in the way of learning, difficulties that young people might face when learning their first language. And then, so write this down, and then keep it, because I may ask you to share later on. So you may stop now. All right, so welcome back from your thinking and writing. And so this here is, a different a model of language. And so these are some different aspects of what language kind of is, I guess, kind of the different kind of parts or features of language, and in particular the English language. So I've kind of arranged this into kind of two main columns, where we have expressive language and then receptive language columns. So kind of in the kind of expressive, we have speaking and writing. So speaking to communicate to other peoples, or writing to communicate to other people or interlocutors. And then receptive, which is kind of understanding what's being talked to you or spoken to you. And then, or reading, which is being able to decode the written system, the orthographic system. In writing, be able to decode. So in writing, we call writing encoding. So writing the orthographic system of the language, encoding. And then reading, we would call it decoding the written system into meaning. So that's receptive. And then Foley and Thompson also talk about these kind of other two key aspects of language acquisition and language learning, which are really important. And so they need to be on this kind of table, although I wouldn't necessarily put these in either expressive or receptive. They're kind of like both. So one is meta-language. So meta-language is language about language. You need to be able to talk you need to have terms and ways of talking about language to be able to understand it. So key features of meta-language are like knowing what nouns or verbs or adverbial phrases are, or noun phrases are, what past tense is, what future tense is, what progressive tense is. That's a type of meta-language. So you need to have those kind of words to be able to kind of communicate or kind of develop an understanding of language. James G., who if you're in my course, will have read, talks about primary and secondary discourses, and in that reading, he talks about how people need to have a fluency in the meta language to be able to critique or emancipate themselves from parts of systems of maybe oppression, because one thing about language is it's never neutral. It's always ideological, according to more kind of social theories of language. And when it's ideological, there might be a way of how language positions people, positions of power, and might be being used to marginalize or oppress certain members of that speech community. And so having a fluency in the meta language is kind of required, she argues, to be able to kind of critique, to be able to change the language system to make it maybe more inclusive or liberating. And then another aspect of language that is Foley and Thompson kind of talk about, and it's really important for sociolinguists, is this kind of concept or an aspect called knowledge, and it's knowledge about language. So knowing how to use language in different social features, how to greet friends and family, or how to greet people or strangers that you might not be familiar with. So these are kind of like the big D. These are kind of like big D rules from G, kind of like the rules of behavior around discourse rules, kind of how to use languages in different systems. How you talk to your friends at Starbucks is a lot different than how you would talk to your physician at the medical clinic. So having it, you'll learn about these kind of language rules, kind of immersed in it, and you'll develop fluencies around this. So that's kind of what they would say is knowledge about language. One thing I want to kind of also talk about is these aspects of language. You are thrown in the world at birth. You start learning these aspects immediately at birth, if not also as a neonate. So, for instance, infants develop a proto-language even at birth. So, what a proto-language is, or infants start developing sounds that might resemble the language that they're being immersed in. So cooing, babbling are type of sounds. One thing is these infants will start differentiating the phonemes of the language system, so the phonemes of Mandarin or the phonemes of English, even at birth. So there's a study from Hong Kong that showed newborns, monolingual newborns, were sensitive to the subtle distinctions in the language spoken by their caregivers. So even at birth, they were able to recognize certain phonemic sounds in their mother's or caregiver's language than that were they wouldn't be able to recognize in, say, if they heard something that was different, a different language or a different sound. Furthermore, that same study indicate the babbling of 10-month-olds, so that babbling sound making that infants make, started to reflect the same phonetic characteristics of the caregiver's primary discourses. So in this study, it was, I think, children in speaking Mandarin, or Mandarin, and their sound character, the phonemic sounds, started resembling the phonetic characteristics of Mandarin in this study. So even at 10 months old, the speaking skills are already, young infants are already starting to mimic or kind of mirror the phonemes that they're already kind of hearing, and they're trying to create those same sounds. So even at a young age, infants are just, the language learning just starts almost, it's at birth, or if not, right before birth. I want to also note, though, the studies about these different kind of phonetic characteristics is representative of children that are growing up in monolingual households. These patterns would be a lot different with children that are growing up in bilingual or multilingual settings. So, for example, my daughter, my partner, she's speaks Korean, and so my daughter would hear Korean. My primary discourse is English, and so she would hear phonemes in English and Korean. And then to really complicate things is Jisoo, my daughter, had to go to a babysitter, spend a portion amount of time as my partner. She was in graduate school and I was working full-time teaching. So the babysitter spoke Mandarin in the household. So my daughter was hearing three different phonemic systems, phonetics characteristics, different phonetic languages with different phonetic characteristics. Mandarin with these tonal kind of phonemes, English, and then Korean phonemes are a little bit different than English phonemes. So Jisoo had a language delay when she was a toddler, and I think what was the contributing factor for that was that at birth she was already immersed in multilingual settings, and so it kind of took her a while to kind of figure out what language system that I need to use these phonemes for. She had to really kind of figure out the language system. I would do a lot of translanguaging, so I would speak some few of the Korean words with her. So she started learning some Korean words and translanguaging English. My daughter learned. So what happened? One interesting story is my daughter learned that dalgi in Korean is strawberry. So she learned both words, what strawberry and dalgi is, but she got frustrated with my partner when my partner was trying to call strawberries dalgi in Korean, and Jisoo would get angry, like, no, that's not a dalgi, it's a strawberry. She was trying to figure out kind of differentiating to the two language systems. Interesting that my daughter calls me my dad in Korean, so she calls me appa. Appa is, and that's what she calls me. However, her knowledge about language, whenever she's with English-speaking children and I'm around, she will refer to me as dad, which is weird because I'm not used to hearing that unless. So that's another interesting aspect of kind of like she knows knowledge about language that if I call my dad Appa in front of my friends, they're not going to understand what that is. So she's going to be, to translate that word with her friends around, which is kind of an interesting move. And that's a lot about knowledge about language, especially with children that are kind of developing some bilingualism. So let's talk about what phonemes are. Phonemes are the smallest kind of unit of sound in a language system. So phonemes are sounds, not letters. So we don't want to confuse phonics, which is a written orthographic letter to a sound, or a symbol, a written symbol that might correspond to a phoneme. So these are sounds that children will develop, and this is the median age of acquisition for children in a monolingual, growing up in a monolingual English household. And there's no one English. There are Englishes, but this is a typical pattern with of how children will develop the phonemes in one of the many Englishes that they are being immersed in as they are born into the world. So the first kind of initial phonemes in English that young children around 1 year, 6 months are the P, B, M, H, N sounds. So the P, 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 the B, 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 and these are kind of interesting. These are the easier sounds to actually generate. So a lot of the cooing that you might hear from infants are going to be these kind of P, P, B, B, M, 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 ha, ha, and W sounds. Wah, wah, wah. And so around a year and 6 months, these sounds are being acquired and used. And then around 2 years old, the K, 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 and then a hard G, the G, G sound, and then da, 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 and then a T, T, T sound around 2 years old. And then around 2 years, 6 months, around this time, and it's not like a hard deadline, but this is kind of the median age, is the F and then the Y sound. So F, and then ya, those sounds. And then around 3 years old, they'll start acquiring or differentiating between it, because in English there is a different phoneme for R and there's a different phoneme for L and then the S. So R, ra, 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 la, 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 S, S, S. Interesting, in Korean, the Korean phonemes for R and L is that they don't differentiate really between the two phonemes. In fact, they're written in the orthographic writing system of Korean. It's the same kind of symbol for R and L, and it really occurs in where this consonant happens in the word. It will maybe make a more R sound or versus a more L sound if it's more of the initial onset, or if it's a more part of the rhyme, depending on. So that's also with P and B in Korean as well. They don't differentiate it much. there is a harder kind of phoneme, but it can be audible if you're it would be harder for a non-Korean speaker to kind of differentiate between these two sounds. And then also around 3 years old, the vowel system of the type of English that the child has been immersed in becomes complete. So the ah, a, ah sounds, and then vowel sounds are very diverse in the different Englishes. So then it'll be the vowel sound that of the or the dialect or the version of English or the English that this child is growing up in. So the vowel sounds would be different, say, of a kid growing up in Manchester, England, versus a kid growing up here in Oneonta, New York. And then around 3 years, 6 months, we get some more kind of the more difficult consonant blends, digraphs, to make the TS, the tss, like cats. So a little bit harder S sound, but it's not quite a Z sound gets developed. And then around 4 years old, they get that kind of that hard Z sound. They start acquiring that. And then also this kind of consonant blend, the DG, like for J's, joke. It's a blend of two kind of sounds combining to make one. So, and then around 4 years, 6 months, the TH sound starts to be acquiring. And English is a rare language that has this kind of phoneme, this digraph, or diphthong, not digraph, this diphthong, which is two letters making a sound. The soft th thing, like in thing, gets acquired, and then around 5 years of age, the harder th diphthong, this, like in the or this, gets acquired. And so interesting for people learning English. This is one of the more difficult kind of phonemes for non-English speakers to kind of master, because that might not, most language systems don't have this. That's something that's really distinctive in English. And then around 6 years old, the hardest phoneme for people to kind of acquire is this j. This is a really long consonant blend. It's basically a consonant blend of almost all these, the S-I-O, without the N sound, is a blend of all these sounds. And so you get the television. It's not television like you would say more in Spanish. It's a blended sound of this. So this j, which is not quite an SH, it's more like an SH at the same time. So television gets acquired. So that's kind of like, and then consonantal distinctions are complete. So around 6 years of age, they've gotten the consonant, the phonemes of the consonants of that language, or in English. So let's talk about some more features of language development, and then we can kind of break language development or language learning down in kind of 4 key categories, which are learning words, which is the lexicon or the register. So as we learn a language, we got to learn what words mean. So here's some examples. A toddler learns a 4-legged creature with a tail is called a dog. Interesting thing is, if they've come across and learned dog and they've never seen a cat before, or a cow or a horse, they might call a cow, horse, or a cat a dog until someone says, no, that's a cat. And then they'll have some cognitive dissonance. So they have to start kind of this learning words. The meanings of words is actually in relationship to other words. So in differentiating to other words what a difference between a dog and a cat is. But they'll have that cognitive dissonance, and they'll start filing it and figuring out, all right, what are the subtle differences between a dog and a cat? And they'll start almost like trying to figure that one out. And then language learning words does not end when you're in childhood. This happens as lifelong learners. So someone that's studying astronomy learns about this word called redshift. And then they'll start using it when describing how when you're measuring light traveling away from an observation, shifts more red in the light spectrum. And so they start using this term, redshift. That's learning the lexicon or the register of astronomy. Now, the next type of language learning that you see happen as we acquire language and develop our language is learning the grammar or syntax. And this is not starting in kindergarten, first, second grade. Again, this is starting at birth. So a toddler learns words that can be arranged in different ways to create new meanings, like in English, where you can have an adjective placed in front of an object or a noun to create a meaning, like hot cookie. Or if it's a toddler in growing up in a Spanish-speaking household, it would be the adjective would go after the noun. So it would be agua calor, like hot water. It would be water hot in that situation. And then also, as well as verb endings, toddler may incorrectly use the regular verb ending with an irregular verb. So the ed, the ed, the past tense marker, the morpheme that says this happened in the past. Children will typically make this kind of mistake, right? They will attach it to an irregular verb, like the dog goed outside instead of the dog went outside. Instead of saying, no, you're wrong, you just do affirmative error correction. So you'll probably hear caregivers say, oh, you mean the dog went outside? And children will get that quickly, meaning, oh, this ed doesn't quite match for this word. And they'll start acquiring that. It's not formally taught, but it's because of immerse, they'll start hearing it. And then moving in from learning to grammar and syntax is then learning to read and write. And this is not starting in kindergarten, first, second, third grade. Children, if they're growing up in a print-rich environment where they're seeing lots of print and text and see lots of books and see caregivers reading and writing, and they're going to childcare, has a lot of learning, writing and reading centers, they will start kind of developing understandings around reading and writing before kindergarten, before even pre-K. So my daughter, Jisoo, she gets to be an example here, is we have special K a lot in our household for cereal. She'd see me eating a lot of special K, especially with special K with strawberries. So she'd see the box in the household, and I kept calling it cereal. So she would see these words, S-P-E-C-I-A-L, and then a K, but I wouldn't call it special K, I would call it cereal. And so one day we're walking in the cereal aisle at the grocery store, and my daughter points to the box. She points to the box, and she like almost finger reads the different letters, and she goes, "This says cereal," and she's kind of like saying this is cereal, and so that's kind of that's how I'm starting to recognize these letters, these weird symbols like an SP, they all come together and they form a word that I already know. So they already know that, oh, I'm going to start having to kind of figure out that I need to, this language system has these kind of features that I will be reading and decoding in. And then writing is very similar. You'll see young children start mimicking writing, like squiggling or scribbling, that mimics the writing system of the language system. So I think I got a little pen here, so hopefully, oops, I don't want to go too far on this, but let's see if I can, there we go. So children growing in English, you might see a lot of squiggles like this, right? Left to right, like that. You'll see some squiggle that looks left to right. And what they noticed that even children growing up in, say, Mandarin, where the writing system is more character-based, like, and it goes up and down, their squiggling might look like that. And so even at a young age, children are starting to kind of understand the written orthography of the writing system they're being immersed in. So that's a really interesting feature. So kids 2-3 years old are already kind of developing an understanding of the reading and writing system. So literacy begins really, really young. So I'll just erase this from here real quick. And then beyond reading and writing is they start learning the social rules of language, which sociolinguistics call pragmatics. So learning to say please and thank you would be kind of the social rules. How to address my parents versus how do I address my aunts and uncles, people like my family members, friends, versus how do I address people I don't know or strangers. These are kind of like the social rules they start developing again at a very young age. Which moves us into the sociolinguistics kind of framing. Language learning and development is social. I'm going to fix this. Let me just fix this. So, language. Nope. There we go. Fix my little error. Okay. Language learning and development is social, which means that here is the speaker or the language learner who has a type of version of, say, let's just say English, an idiolect. So a unique way of using language, and it's very individual, based off of kind of the many different life experiences and different speech communities and discourses, primary discourse, secondary discourses, that this individual will be growing up to. But it's not isolated from the larger social aspect of language learning. So the idiolect that we speak is really much influenced by kind of the speech community that you are born into. And so this is very Vygotskian. Vygotsky had a big book on a lot of his theories on how children acquire or learn language. And it's Vygotsky argued that it's an external social world that kind of apprentices through a zone of proximal development young people's acquisition of language. And it's through the social external ways, and children doing monologues, talking to themselves, monologue is then becomes internalized as an idiolect, internal. So that internal narrator that we might hear in our head as we're going about our life is initially a social aspect that gets internalized into our cognition. So even the very aspect of our idiolect is coming from a larger external social world. And so these are kind of the different kind of layers of the onion to get to the person speaking or listening or reading or writing. The idiolect is, there's the speech community, the big D discourse, or sometimes it could be a secondary discourse community that the interlocutor is in. And then there's the speech situation, so the kind of what type of like going to Starbucks to order some coffee would be a speech situation. And then the event itself, more kind of temporal. This time I'm going to McDonald's, but I might use similar speech situations from other social situations that I've learned to kind of have a conversation about how to order a hamburger. And then there's the speech act itself, which is kind of how do I communicate that I want a coffee or a hamburger, or how do I communicate that my arm hurts or my shoulder hurts to my doctor, are all kind of framed around social aspects. And then I will understand my listening and then my speaking or reading and writing to communicate within outward towards that, but it's not isolated. And according to social linguists, you can't isolate language away from the social aspect, and this is something that it's really difficult in literacy learning as well, because literacies are kind of these ways of communicating through these kind of social events. Also cannot really be isolated from the social event, social act, the literacy practice itself. So I just want to make that kind of clear, is we can't just dissect the language out of the social aspect of language. Language is enveloped in the social world, and it can't be kind of analyzed in a vacuum, although people do try. But we're talking more social linguistic frameworks of language development, which is more kind of appropriate to kind of how pedagogy works with literacy learning. So With that, let's talk about, so we talked about how Vygotsky, you learn internalize the social languages that you're immersed in, you start developing idiolect, and then you have what we call socio-cognitive, so the internal thinking, but also the social supports to support our thinking and ways of using. So these are kind of three frameworks, very similar, but they're a little bit different, of socio-cognitive frameworks to talk about language. And these are really important for educators because we need to think about how we can do this in our contents and our classes. So the first one is I want to kind of talk about schema theory. And you may have heard a lot of this in like some ed psych courses around activating schema or activating background knowledge. You might have heard those terms, and that's applying schema theory, socio-cognitive frameworks, to kind of like, all right, here's the schema, so this will activate kind of our understanding of the text if students have experience with this type of schema. So here are some examples. So here is how schema theory can be applied. So a Bills fan who's activates the schema of sports fandom, and in particular professional football. Paints his body blue and red, goes shirtless to the big game in December, and then even drops colorful expletives before, during, and after the game. And those are generally acceptable uses of language and behaviors for that setting, that schema. However, that same Bills fan is also a medical doctor, but he does not paint his body blue or red when he's at the clinic, but instead he wears the white lab coat and greets patients kindly and politely, which is the appropriate schema for that setting. Now, if this Bills fan decided to do the behavior that he did at the game at the clinic, that is inappropriate use of language, right? So instead of saying wrong or right, he's inappropriately using this schema for this different language or social situation. And so we got to get our students to understand that language, we need to get our students to understand the schemas of how to communicate or write or read within these type of texts within these certain schemas. And sometimes it's not appropriate to do this in other schemas. So students that use textese and more academic writing systems, so like I had some students in ninth grade and even in some development writing courses use letters like textese, like the letter for FOR, LOL, kind of these textese, instant messaging kind of schemas around writing and communicating inappropriately in academic schemas where they needed to write more edited American English. And it's not right or wrong, they're just applying the wrong schema for this speech act or writing act. So that's schema theory, and this is why it's really important for educators to activate schema, or students that might not have had experience with a schema, then you front load and you develop a schema for students to understand the text. This is really a pre-teaching activity, and you got to frame reading and writing around this. So getting students to understand the schema first before we can learn to kind of understand, decipher, critique that schema, that text that exists in that schema. And then we can move kind of more into the smaller bits is frame theory. Framing theory is a socio-cognitive kind of framing, is kind of in speaking, or I do this in texting as well, to show solidarity with close friends or colleagues. You might use some frames to kind of like, hey, I'm your friend. I might start a speech or even texting, because my friends live far away, is "What's up, Coachies?" which is from a 90s Beastie Boys video, because my friends and we liked that video when we were younger. And so we understand what this means, but anyone that's not in this kind of close friendship would like look at us sideways. But this is what we use to greet each other, and it's kind of, all right, we're going to have a conversation now. That's framing. Media literacy uses frame theory quite interestingly, is because you always want to know how a news article might be framing the subject of inquiry. And so framing is a way of how you could either get people to understand a certain topic and also from a different point of view or a bias, right? So frame theory kind of like biases come through with how certain things might get framed. So frame theory is really important. And then script theory, which is almost kind of this is another kind of like what it says, script. You almost internalized or memorized a script like you're an actor at a play. There are certain social events that happen so often, you internalize these kind of scripts. You don't even realize that you're doing these scripts. So many of you experience this phenomenon where you walking in and see a friend or a colleague in the hallway, and I raise my hand, I smile, I say, "How are you doing?" My colleague, we're walking right by. She replies, "I'm fine, and you?" And then it's almost automatic, and we just keep walking by. It's a script. We're like a program that we're just kind of repeating. That's kind of a script, and so we need to learn what are the schemas and the frames and the scripts of our contents, right? How do we, so we want to think about the reading and writing and the literacies through kind of these socio-cognitive lens, because these are social thinking supports that we can help our students learn. So we want to think of the social cognitive frameworks to help support our students' literacy development. Which gets into, we move from socio-cognitive to socio-semantic. So how we make meaning and communicate meaning with words. So this is based off of Halliday's systemic functional linguistics, which he kind of did some research on young children from birth to teens, kind of phases of their language development. And so Halliday kind of highlighted kind of 3 phases. Again, this is a spectrum. It's not discrete kind of like clear boundaries, but there's a kind of a trajectory of will from phase 1 to phase 3, which again doesn't have a 3 here, so let's fix that. And there we go, and we'll switch my settings. There, phase 3. I always gotta edit while I'm performing my slideshows. This is kind of how I do my proofreading editing. Anyway, so phase 1 is kind of like that from birth, starts from birth, the proto-language to child language. So from these cooing and babblings of infants to young children using words. So this are kind of like the different stages of phase 1. So the first phase of the proto-language is using sounds as instrumental. So using sounds as a general demand and specific demand. So I'm hungry, or feed me, or I'm bored kind of instruments, or I'm unhappy, or something's going on, I don't feel well. They use the instruments of their body, their vocal cords, to communicate a meaning to other people. Help me, get their caregiver to focus on them and demand, I need something. And then that moves into more regulatory kind of use of cooing and babbling to like general command. And then it could be like one word, yes, no, one word kind of instances where they command or demand some specific command or intensify a command. And then they'll start moving into the interactional phase where they'll start greeting and personal greetings and smiling, the kind of language pragmatics. And it's really kind of funny when you're seeing infants, especially at a store with their parents, and they start smiling and waving and saying hi, and you don't know who they are, but they're doing that kind of, they're learning, I can smile and wave and say hello to these other human beings. It's kind of fun and cute. And so they're learning that interactional move from proto-language to child language. And then next phase would be they start kind of learning to express how they feel about the world. These kind of complex emotions they start feeling, they can start kind of expressing kind of these feelings to other people. And then they'll start moving into more heuristic kind of uses of language, where they'll start imitating other things they hear or say. as a heuristic. Okay, so I'm going to figure out what this is. I'm going to start imitating something like call and response or something, and it could be something they hear on TV, or it could be just hear their parents say. They'll imitate a response. They'll acknowledge an imitation. So even like peekaboo games, like the peekaboo that caregivers would play with children. This is an important language development kind of game to develop the proto-language child language. So even again, at a young age, these are kind of activities that you would help develop. And then children will move into imagination. And this is why I think universal pre-K or universal childcare is so important, is so we can get all children universal access to these kind of really print-rich, sensory-rich environments where they get to see other human beings, meet other kids, and it's through this imagination where they start pretend playing and having these monologues with themselves, but also pretend parallel playing with other children, having pretend play, parallel play with. They'll do the same thing. They're not quite communicating with each other yet, but they'll start, zipping their cars to right by side, kind of parallel playing with each other. And then you'll see that in a really rich childcare environment. And then you start seeing kind of song games, jingles, and rhyming games. Those are really important kind of imaginary kind of activities to develop children's language. And then they start kind of using language to inform. This is this is that. They start kind of more expository kind of development of the language use. And then, so once they're kind of got this, they'll start moving into phase 2, which is their transition from that more simplified child language to more of that adult system use of language. So you'll start seeing them moving away from just monologued, where they're just monologuing to themselves, having conversations with themselves, to dialogue with other human beings, or dialogic interaction with others. And then also learning the rules of how to interact with others. That's why when you see children parallel playing alongside each other, if you've ever gone to a child care center, or observed young children in a setting like that, you'll see 3 or 4 year olds, they'll be side by side parallel playing, doing the same thing, because but they're still kind of developing this rule, learning the language system. How do I communicate to this other person that's also playing the car that we want to do this together? So they're going to start moving from modeling to dialogue. They'll start kind of learning rules like, hi, my name's Thor, and kind of, what's your name type of way of learning how to interact with others. And then they're moving into a more of adult system use of language, where it's functioning as more of communicating with other beings. And so this moves into phase 3, which is where children will start learning new ideational meanings, how to create those meanings, either speaking or writing of words, and their relationships with the interpersonal social context. And then they'll start kind of using the ideational symbols, or it could be pictures, or it could be part of the writing system, which leads to text functions. So they start producing texts using these kind of symbols, pictures. They start, young children drawing pictures and stuff. They're starting to create, those are texts. They're starting to communicate meaning to the world, even at a young age. So that's kind of the phase 3 that they'll start moving in. This is more kind of that adult system of kind of meaning making with language, and kind of more of that the literacies that start happening. Practices. They start understanding the literacy practices, and they start coming forth in phase 3 a lot. Really, still they're really kind of very young, even at phase 3. So that is kind of a quick summary of kind of 3.5 chapters that you didn't have to read, of kind of like social linguistic frameworks of how we all acquire our language, or languages that we speak. And so what I'm going to do is now we're going to have created a general discussion. So one thing I want you to do is also share your writing into the day as a general discussion. What did you write about? And then here are how you would frame your kind of discussion to contribute to the conversation about this topic. So I want you to make your own connections to socio-linguistic frameworks of how you have learned your heritage language and or other languages you have learned or are learning. And then as you're making these connections, I want you to use the technical words or registers in these connections. So these new technical words that you might have learned today, like idiolect and phoneme, I want you to use them in your discussion. This is one way people learn new vocabulary words, is you got to use them in a real context. So I want you to use these new words that you've come across in your readings up till now, or in this discussion that you've heard, and you want to try them out. And then part 2 is, I want you, how might these frameworks, so I presented different frames like socio-cognitive frames to socio-semantic frames, of how children learn language leads to more general understandings of how children may learn in general. So how do these frameworks how can we kind of generalize these frameworks to how children may learn in your content in general? So math, earth science, biology, the languages, language arts, social studies, economics, cooking, sewing, fashion, design, architecture, all of those things. So I want you to, how can you apply these frames? Because I think these will be useful frames for any other type of learning that would go into your classroom. And then the final thing that I want you to do is I want you to create a question, and I want you to pose a question for your thinking partners to think about and answer. Because part of your job is, one, you're going to read and respond to other of your colleagues' posts, and you're going to answer their questions, but you also need to be a good, responsible thinking partner and interlocutor. Is you need to ask questions to your partner as well. That's a good kind of like social linguistic aspect of how we use language. We want to ask questions to people to kind of learn more about them more, but also to inspire thinking. And so create and pose a question for your colleagues, and then when you're doing this discussion, since it's more asynchronous, you're going to follow kind of like, all right, I do a general post, I'll see if anyone has kind of posted something, I'll read what they wrote, I'll respond to it, I'll respond to their question. Then you might return a few hours later and someone's responded to your question, and then you can curate that kind of discussion thread. So try to think of how you would do a face-to-face conversation with a colleague that's over a span of time that's not in the same space or time, is how we do this. So discussion, having an asynchronous discussion is not, I'm just going to write my discussion and I'm done. That's perfunctory, and as we learned, we need to have conversations, we need to have dialogic interactions with others to really have a deeper learning. And so in order to do dialogical conversations in an asynchronous environment, you need to not only just post, but pose questions. You need to come back and curate the threads as well and continue the communication. So that will take a little bit longer than an hour and 10-minute class that we would typically have in my face-to-face classes. So that's the discussion for today's lecture, and I will look forward to seeing what kind of thoughts you have about language acquisition, language development, and questions that you have. So that is it for today, and I will see everyone a little bit later.